Tonight on Talking Politics, some Boston city councilors want to bring police and metal detectors back to that city's public schools, but would it cause more problems than it solves? One of those city councilors will join me ahead to make her case, along with the executive director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice. But first, Governor Healey had her first leadership meeting this week with the leaders of the State House and Senate, together known as the Big Three, or the Big Four if you count the lieutenant governor. And afterwards they took questions from reporters, though many of the answers were a bit light on specifics.
We talked about a number of things, and it was the first opportunity for us to gather as a leadership team, and so that was special for the lieutenant governor and myself.
A couple topics they did touch on, albeit briefly: tax relief and proposals for free community college, at least for some people. Both were promises that Healey made on the campaign trail, neither of which, though, at this point seems like they are right around the corner. Joining me now to dig into this and a few other developments from the past week are MassLive State House reporter Alison Kuznitz and GBH News State House reporter Katie Lannan. Thank you both for being here. Alison, let me start with you. These Big Three meetings are a regular ritual on Beacon Hill. Did Healey approach this particular one in the same way that Baker approached his meetings with Spilka and Mariano, or were some things different?
Sure. Well, first off, this actually has not been too much of a regular ritual on Beacon Hill in the last few months. The Big Three just did not meet until the very end. So it'll be interesting to see if Governor Healey, she has said she's committed to continuing to meet with the House Speaker and the Senate President. So we'll see if that really does continue. One big difference was I want to say Attorney General, the Governor Maura Healey did not include the Republican minority leadership at the leadership meeting, and that was a big break from Baker. So we will see that Governor Healey said she is committed to continuing the conversation with Republican leaders, but it was a notable gap. And just visually, as you saw in the footage, reporters were not invited into the governor's office as is traditional. We were standing outside of the governor's office, so that just led to a more compressed press scrum than usual. But I'm told that was the case in some of Governor Baker's initial press briefing.
You know, unlike you guys, I just dip into and out of the building, and I do remember seeing some avails that were outside, but it's a different feel. It doesn't feel as open to the public if you're talking to them outside the governor's office. Katie, in my experience, again, limited compared to you two, these avails tend to run the gamut from really informative to almost completely useless. How would you situate this one?
I mean, the big key detail we learned was that the cookie that Speaker Mariano was enjoying was an oatmeal one. And part of that is just a function of the fact that the legislative session's not really underway yet. You know, the bill filing deadline hasn't come to pass yet. And we're still waiting, like you said, for a lot of these concrete details about what these policies that Maura Healey has talked about on the campaign trail and in her inaugural address will look like. And that will give lawmakers something to react to more concretely. For now, it was more of a show of how they're going to approach their collaboration, of making a point to return to, as Alison said, what had once been weekly meetings, but really dwindled to maybe once a month. And to make sure the press knew, I guess, in a way that they'd be ready to take our questions. It's,
by the way, just as an aside, a very embarrassing testament to how suggestible I am that seeing Ron Mariano chewing and hearing you say the words oatmeal cookie now has me like ready to buy an oatmeal cookie.
I'm thinking about him all week.
Katie, let me stay with you for a second. Ron Mariano, the cookie eater who we've been discussing, is at present, at least while we speak, holding off on seating a couple of newly elected Democratic state representatives and getting some pushback for it. Why is he waiting to seat these elected representatives, and why are people ticked off?
These were very close races. One was decided by one vote, the other, I believe, in the double digits. And these two House districts, the Republicans in both, who at last count were the losing side of those elections, had legal challenges that they were trying to pursue. There were recounts. The Speaker says he wants to make sure that there's, no question that all the legal avenues can be pursued, and that ultimately the elections can't be called into question. It is the House, according to the Constitution and a 2003 Supreme Court ruling, that gets to decide who gets seated in the House. But it is a very rare thing that you only see. It's only happened a couple times in the past 2 decades that it's gotten to this point where right now on Friday there's a special House committee examining hearing from the candidates and their attorneys in these 2 races and trying to decide how to proceed.
And could that decision be made? We're taping this before we broadcast on TV at 7 o'clock. Could that decision be made before we end up broadcasting?
Hope not, because that'll affect my day.
sometimes.
But no, I don't think so. They're holding the hearings today to really gather information. In 2003, when this similar kind of situation played out, they ultimately made a decision in March. So it's a review process.
Legislative pace. And as you mentioned, there are legal challenges that are currently underway.
Right.
Alison, I want to get your take as a political observer and analyst on some of the pushback. Eileen Duff, the governor's counsel, sent out a very disapproving tweet referring to what Ron Mariano is or isn't doing. She tweeted, "Most state reps don't want to acknowledge Ron Mariano refusing to seat 2 legally elected women today." Brad Jones, the Republican legislative leader, is thrilled about the coup. And then she hashtagged Elect Women Emerge, Mass Women's Political Caucus, election results, and democracy matters. To your eye, is there misogyny or antipathy to democracy evident in what Ron Mariano is doing here?
I think what really struck me about what this House Speaker has done is a few hours after he was reelected as a House Speaker, a reporter had asked him to explain that decision. And when he had been giving some vague answers, a reporter probed, which candidate are you exactly talking about? And he said he wasn't super familiar with the races in question. So I think that kind of sheds some light. And I think also to just take into context that Mariano's decision happened just around the anniversary of January 6th. So that just feeds into the concern about election denialism and just recognizing that last year in the House had blocked within the Votes Act of Sweeping Voting Reforms Act to allow same-day voter registration, election day voter registration.
Good point.
Into some other issues with voting rights in the House chamber.
Alison, Maura Healey, the new governor, went public this week with her current relationship after pretty much keeping quiet about that topic during the campaign. She did it in a Boston Globe column by Yvonne Abraham, in which both she and her partner of now 2 years, Joanna Lydgate, weighed in. Politically speaking, why do you think the governor waited until now to open up this part of her private life?
So the column touches on the fact that Healey is making it out that it was not a political decision at all, that just by the fact that her partner is in the middle of a divorce, that she just realized her sexual orientation. She has children. So I think that there was just some really complex issues that the governor and her partner wanted to keep private. But I think it did create a noticeable gap on the campaign trail that most candidates are typically with their spouses or significant others, whereas the governor-elect or the attorney general at the time, she was mostly with her sister or close confidant. So that did create a gap. But we also know that, of course, Governor Healey campaigned on the fact that she'd be the first openly gay woman to lead the state. So I think people would have supported it. And that's also what the governor said in the story, that they would have, that would not have necessarily affected voters' views of Healey.
Katie Lannan, broadly speaking, and I'm asking you to make a huge generalization here, but are the personal lives of policymakers a topic of interest on Beacon Hill among you guys who cover the proceedings there, among politicians, legislative aides, lobbyists, or are they an afterthought if they're thought about at all?
Yeah, I think you have to separate in 2 different kind of ways of looking at it, right? There's Beacon Hill, the seat of state government, and then there's Beacon Hill, the workplace, where you know this many people show up every day and see the same people every day. And obviously there is what you'd consider workplace gossip. There's interest in people's lives. But look at former Governor Charlie Baker. First Lady Lauren Baker was not much of a public figure aside from her work with the Wonder Fund supporting DCF-involved youth. She chose more of a background role. And you can contrast that to a few years ago, then Senate President Stan Rosenberg. His husband, Brian Hefner, was really the center of a lot of press and public and legislative attention after it was revealed that he was involved in Senate affairs.
Heavily involved.
There were allegations, a whole court case about sexual assault and harassment. So something like that, when a personal life makes its way into the circumstances beyond the personal, then there's a lot of attention, but it is something otherwise that mostly plays out in the background.
I had forgotten about that Hefner case, and that was a remarkable bit of melodrama. Alison, you did a story a couple of days ago about the relationship between the Healey administration, the nascent Healey administration, and environmental advocates, how it's unfolding. And there was an event tell me if I've got this right, a virtual rally in which both administration members and advocates participated that was the hook for your piece. What did you see in that virtual rally when you covered it?
So it was really interesting. So we saw a number of climate activists, and we also saw a number of lawmakers, including Senators Cream, Senators Roush, Senator Barrett, and a few other state reps on there who had been just talking about what they had accomplished in the last legislative session with climate laws and what they're hoping to accomplish in the new legislative session as far as, decarbonization of buildings and maybe creating a green bank. Really, the big hook of the event was that Melissa Hoffer, Governor Healey's new climate chief, was on the event. And so it was her fourth day of the job. She said she's kind of just in the middle, of course, of easing into the role. But we got to hear a little more about her interactions with activists and how Melissa Hoffer really views the role of activists in creating her role and a new climate resiliency office within the governor's office.
What did she say about how she sees the role of activists in shaping what she does?
I think she said that they really sounded the alarms about needing to create this person that is going to be so centrally focused within state government, and how Healey has pitched the role and how Melissa Hoffer has really pitched the role as well, is that it's going to be so intersectional that it's not just going to be climate in a silo. It's going to be how does climate affect housing, transportation, food security, so many other areas. But we did not necessarily see some of those other types of activists on the call as well. And we did not see Rebecca Tepper, who is Healey's Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, joining the call either.
Did you see on the call the sort of the harder core of environmental activists? Because I think of the environmental community, like many advocacy communities, as having people who are somewhat moderate and pragmatic and people who go quite a bit harder. Was the hardcore, as I'm describing them there?
I think the hardcore was definitely in the chat. They were not necessarily acknowledged within the broader talking points, but I think it was really just kind of a way to get some of the more moderate activists involved. So the Sierra Club, Mass 350 series, a nonprofit, were on there. So they were just kind of laying the groundwork in a very fundamental way. But I think it was rather impressive that they did have Melissa Hoffer so early on to be able to join the rally.
Yeah, that's striking. That's going to be a fascinating plot to watch unfolding moving forward. Alison Kuznitz and Katie Lannan, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up, a year and a half after Boston officials took police officers out of the city's schools, a group of city councilors are urging Mayor Michelle Wu to bring them back. The push was prompted by a fight outside of a Mattapan elementary and middle school last week. Police say 3 teenage girls attacked a fellow student and a teacher from the Young Achievers Science and Math Pilot School, sending both to the hospital. In response, City Councilors Erin Murphy, Michael Flaherty, Frank Baker, and Council President Ed Flynn sent a letter to the Mayor and Superintendent Mary Skipper, arguing, quote, there should be no question among city and state education officials about returning non-invasive technology such as metal detectors and having police officers present in our schools. I'm joined now by Councilor Erin Murphy and Leon Smith, the Executive Director of Citizens for Juvenile Justice. Thank you both for being here. Councilor Murphy, let me start with you. I'm curious, if that really ugly incident outside Young Achievers had not occurred, would you and your 3 colleagues still have made this request, or was that the catalyst for what happened?
Absolutely. As you know, the new legislative year started. It was included in the letter because it had just happened, but I had filed several hearing orders last year to address the violence and to get to the numbers to make sure that the city of Boston, in Boston Public Schools, is actually sharing the correct data. Because one of the concerns I hear time and time again from parents, concerned parents across the city, is that when incidents happen, the communication is lacking and they're not told about it, or they hear about it a few days later in the news. So I was already going to be filing the hearing order, which I did last Wednesday at our first council meeting. to make sure that we have Boston Police, school resource offices, and the school department and ourselves here on the council talking, communicating to make sure that all students and staff are safe at our schools.
You mentioned in the letter that there were 440 reported bullying incidents and 744 reported sexual assaults in the 2021-2022 school year. I think I've got those numbers right. How does that compare to past years? Do you have a sense of how that data measures up?
Sure. So when I had a hearing order last year about the number of incidents in our system, I made sure to go back to 2019, back when the last full school year, to compare data, because we know with school closure and remote learning during COVID, so that we could have a full year. And bullying incidents were up 80% reported, and sexual assaults were up around 60% in our schools. And we also, I didn't include in that statistic in this hearing order or that letter, also the violent just physical assaults across the system, Rob.
Okay, thanks for that context. Leon Smith, what is your take on the wisdom of Council Murphy and her colleagues' proposal?
So what I would say is that we all want our schools to be places where younger people can feel not just safe, but also supported, welcomed, and uplifted. But the key is how we get there. And you know, one of the issues that I have with the request of the counselors is I feel like some of the language presents school safety as a zero-sum game where it's either police, metal detectors, and other school hardening types of approaches, or it's no safety at all, and that simply isn't true. It's CFJJ as a statewide organization that not only engages in advocacy, but does a significant amount of research in this arena. We feel that it's a flawed premise to exclusively rest the issue of school safety on policing and other hardening methods, because there's significant research that debunks the effectiveness of these approaches at increasing school safety. And secondly, there are different pathways that can both increase school safety and meet the needs of young people who are struggling, but that focus on meeting their social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs that often underlie this behavior. So the conversation needs to not simply be focused on the school hardening piece, but really addressing the needs of young people who came back into our schools after the pandemic, which we know disproportionately impacted poor communities and communities of color, and led to significant mental, social, emotional, and behavioral health impacts on these young people.
I want to ask you a little bit about some of the other techniques that you mentioned, but first I want to give Councilor Murphy a chance to just to respond to what you said. Councilor, do you see, my sense, and Leon, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, my sense is that Leon is concerned that you and your colleagues might see police presence and metal detectors as the tools necessary to create a safe environment for kids. So I just want to get
I'd like to say I 100% agree with what he said. And I do know that oftentimes in this Twitter world, it's A or B, and definitely this conversation has been put into a box. So I was a Boston public school teacher for over 20 years, a former BPS student myself, and a parent of BPS children. So I absolutely know firsthand, and as a classroom teacher and a special ed teacher coordinator, I myself made sure that I had the proper social emotional training for my students and advocated as a teacher and as a special ed coordinator that those services were increased in our schools. And now on the council, the first hearing order I filed back in 2022 when I was first on the council was a hearing order to address the mental health crisis of our children and to make sure that we're putting services not just in our public schools, but in our before and after school programming, that we're making sure that our after school programs, our YMCAs, our BCYFs, our community centers are staffed properly and funded properly to support the mental health crisis that all of us know our children were suffering before the COVID pandemic, but it's even worse now. So I just want to make sure that it's clear that I don't think it's more police and have this police state in our schools is ever going to fix anything. But there are 6-year-olds bringing guns to school. There are gunshots at our high schools. There are knives. There are fights. I get text messages of, 25 students fighting in a bathroom and heads being banged against toilets. So there are absolutely times that there are incidences across our school where students are crying in classrooms. In the case at Young Achievers, the student knew she didn't feel safe to walk home, and that's why the teacher followed her and supported her to get home. So there has to be a time when, what's it going to take is my opinion.
Councilor, let me just, I apologize for interrupting. Thank you for clarifying that. I wanted to jump back to Leon for a moment and get Leon to say, is that the sort of thing, when the councilor talks about doing other things to support student mental health and well-being, did she touch on the sort of alternate approaches that you have in mind, or are you thinking of still other methods for making sure that students feel safe and secure?
She certainly did touch on some of those alternate approaches, but I want to go a little deeper and say, when you truly make your schools trauma informed, when you truly make the investment in staff, and when you implement, and I mean faithfully to the model, implement alternatives like restorative justice and peer mediation in schools, you're able to take a proactive and preventative approach to school safety. So, as someone who spent more than 2 decades working in the juvenile system, I've always posed this question: is safety merely responding to a conflict that escalates, or is safety having the embedded resources in place that you're able to get to those conflicts before they arise and before they escalate and before they become the type of fight or other type of situation that we want? What we've seen in looking in jurisdictions across the country where, from the top down, from city leadership to school district leadership to school leadership, where they've really invested in restorative practice with training and ongoing professional development, you're able to get to some of these situations early. The young person who comes into the school building and they're not in a good place, you're able to give that young person a space with a professional to help them get recentered and refocused on learning, rather than have some of that hypervigilance or some of those other trauma behaviors escalate.
Leon, I apologize. Now it's my turn to apologize for interrupting you. Along those lines, no. This is an incredibly complex topic that we're talking through here. I jumped in because I wanted to get you, when you were talking about preventative versus reactive approaches to this, I wanted to get your take on something that Larry Alison, who's a detective on the BPD's citywide schools unit and also a former president of the Mass Association of Minority Law Enforcement Officers, I wanted to get your comment on a statement he made to the Boston Globe. He said essentially that police officers, if they're used right, can be part of that preventative system. He said, right now police are not in there unless it's an emergency, and what does that tell you? That it's a little too late to prevent it. We can get out ahead of things to keep these kids from getting into trouble or hurting themselves or others. We should know if there's something that may be triggering their behavior and how to respond to it, and that doesn't get captured in a 911 call. So do you think that when you talk about creating an effective preventative system, can you envision police being a part of that or not, ultimately?
Unfortunately, when you look at the research in execution, that typically doesn't happen. So in 2020, CFJJ, along with our contemporaries at Strategies for Youth, we did a report called Fail School Policing in Massachusetts, where we simply looked at some of the arguments in support of police placement, like that Mr. Ellison makes, and said, do they really stand up to the current body of research out there? And what we found in doing the research, peer-reviewed research, is that police placement, there's simply very little evidence that it actually increases school safety, but there was considerable evidence that simply placing a police officer in a school leads to an increase in school-based arrests for low-level, nonviolent behaviors that have traditionally been the domain of school disciplinarians. So not just for the types of serious incidents that we see on the front pages, you see a flow of young people being pushed into the legal system when you have officers in schools. And as someone who's practiced in juvenile courts across the city, I've certainly seen those cases come in. myself.
Councilor Murphy, I want to get you to engage with the point that Leon just raised, but first I want to roll a little bit of video from a conversation we had with Zyra Mercer back during the 2021 mayor's race. She at the time was the student representative on the Boston School Committee, and she raised a point similar to the one Leon just made, talking about how it feels as a student when you go into a school where there are metal detectors set up. Let's take a look at how she described it.
Going through metal detectors, I don't think that's the best way. I feel like when you have the students walk through metal detectors, get searched, get screened, that's aiding in the prison to school pipeline. That's aiding in them becoming a prisoner in the future. That's not helping anyone. That's creating more trauma and making students not want to come to school because it isn't help in safety. It makes you feel more unsafe.
So, Councilor Erin Murphy, go ahead, please.
So I hear this time and time again, and I need to go through a metal detector every morning when I come here to work. You have to go through a metal detector, and I think even your eyes are scanned if you want to go to the Magic Kingdom, right? To get into the courthouse, there's many times on a plane that you need to go through a metal detector. And so I don't feel that the argument that a metal detector is going to increase the violence in a school. And when we know that our school system is struggling, to say the least, and last year when we were going through the DESE report that finally came out, it said that the Boston public school system does not support the physical, social, or emotional well-being of our students to ensure a safe environment. And it also said that the district system for managing and responding to any concerns is not where it needs to be. And that's why we're losing so many families and so many of our schools, even academically. We're not in many schools like Madison Park High that has many incidents of violence. Only 9% of the students at Madison Park High are reading on grade level. So we have a really struggling school system. And I do think as a former teacher that we have to make sure that students feel welcomed and safe, but they also, when something happens, because students are bringing weapons to school, parents are choosing, and many times we saw the biggest percentage of students we lost the last few years were our Black and brown students. They're going more into the Medco system or they're going into our charter schools because those families do not want their children in an environment where they don't feel safe.
Councilor Erin Murphy and Leon Smith, I once more apologize for interrupting. I'm only doing it because we're out of time. But I want to say before I let you go, this is obviously an incredibly delicate and complicated topic. So I appreciate both of you coming to share your perspectives on it. And my guess is, if you're amenable, that we'll be checking back in with you as this conversation unfolds, because there's a lot more to get into. Councilor Erin Murphy and Leon Smith, thank you both. That's it for tonight, but please do come back next week. And in the interim, tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics, or you can find me on Twitter.
Reparations for people of Africa.